Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Is Canada's EV sales mandate dead in the water?
We have a comprehensive plan to build a robust electric vehicle supply chain and supporting infrastructure. Today, we're announcing the next step in this plan, the Electric Vehicle Availability Standard that drives Canada towards all new light-duty vehicle sales in Canada to be electric or plug-in hybrid by 2035. This includes the interim goals along the way, beginning with 20% of all new vehicle sales be EVs by 2026.
That was the Minister for Environment and Climate Change, Stephen Guilbeault, in December 2023, announcing the federal government's EV sales mandate. It was supposed to begin next year, but now that's looking increasingly unlikely. This past week, Canada's big auto sector industry groups all came together in Ottawa to call on the federal government to scrap this plan entirely. Why? Well, they say now that the federal government has also stopped subsidizing electric vehicle purchases, the mandate plan is doomed to fail. The government's response so far? Crickets. It's just one of the many files that's been thrown into chaos since Prime Minister Trudeau prorogued Parliament and announced his plans to step down later this year. Meanwhile, Donald Trump will take office on Monday, and we are waiting to see if he follows through with that threat to impose 25% tariffs on all Canadian goods, including cars and auto parts. What does it all mean for the vision of Canada as a country with 100% electric vehicle sales by 2035? I'm David Smith, and this is The Big Story. And my guest today is Brian Kingston, President and CEO of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. Hi, Brian. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So you and some of your fellow industry groups in the auto sector came out on Parliament Hill this week demanding the government take another look at its electric vehicle sales mandate. For listeners who may be a little bit out of the loop here, what is the status of the current plan on the books from the federal government for the EV mandate?
So last year, the federal government came forward with a zero-emission vehicle sales mandate, which dictates an increasing ratio of EV sales in Canada starting in 2026 at 20%. And then it climbs up to 100% sales by 2035. So a rather short window to move from, we're just hit 16% in the third quarter of 2024, up to 100% over the next decade. So that's where we stand at this point in time. And we've been calling on government to be much more aggressive in terms of putting in place consumer supports to put us on a path to success.
Yes, and I understand that's why the call this week on the government is to reconsider this whole plan. Tell me about why you're calling on the government to scrap its EV mandate now.
Well, we were opposed to the mandate from the get-go. The government has been talking about this for the better part of 4 years, and we've made it clear to them that this policy is, first of all, redundant and unnecessary, but secondly, there's no evidence that these mandates actually work. When I say it's redundant, what I mean is we have existing regulations in Canada for auto manufacturers that increase the stringency of tailpipe emissions allowed to come out of vehicles. And those are getting more and more stringent every single year. The only way that a manufacturer can comply with those regulations in Canada is through mass electrification. So our question from the get-go to the federal government, to Minister Guilbeault, was, why do you need a belt and suspenders? We have these regulations. We're complying with them. More EVs are coming into the market every single week. Why do you need a mandate that actually dictates what vehicles Canadians can and can't buy? It made no sense. And so that was our first issue with it. And what we heard from the federal government was, well, there isn't enough EV inventory in Canada. We need this regulation to force inventory. And, we're now seeing we're oversupplied with electric vehicles across the country. We've got in 9 of 10 provinces, we're either at target levels or oversupplied. So the EVs are here. We don't need the mandate. What we need is the consumer supports. And so we thought it was important to come out and really make the case to government right now, particularly given that they've just scrapped their consumer incentive. We had to make it clear that these targets are not achievable and this regulation is the wrong approach.
Right, right. If there isn't enough incentive for consumers to want to buy these vehicles, to be able to buy these vehicles, there's no sense mandating that car companies have to sell them. If nobody's going to buy them, how can you mandate a car company that they have to sell them? Now, on the consumer incentive side of things, the government had a rebate program. If you buy an eligible electric vehicle, the government of Canada will give you $5,000. What happened to that incentive program this week?
So the incentive program has closed. It has run out of money. And look, positive side of that is that this is a good program. It's obviously working. Canadians are using it. People are buying electric vehicles. It's been very popular. But the problem is that the federal government announced last Friday that there was $70 million left to prepare for the program to wind down. We then heard on Monday that it was closed. All funds had been committed. And this has created just absolute chaos in the market. You have dealerships that were in the process of selling an EV on the premise that the incentive was there, who are now being told it's no longer available. It's created quite a bit of confusion. So the way in which this was handled was not very effective. And then, of course, it's just the wrong message as we're a year out from the EV mandate to say no more incentives. That's a real problem for the industry.
Wow. So just to be perfectly clear, if I was in a dealership on Friday and decided I want to take the plunge, I want to get into this electric vehicle, I'll come in and pay for it and sign the papers on Monday. For some people, there was a chance when they went back to the dealership on Monday, the dealer had no choice but to say, we can no longer offer you that $5,000 discount on this vehicle. Was that happening?
Yep, that's exactly what happened. Now, some manufacturers are honoring the incentive. If there was already a clear sale on the horizon, they're making that customer whole. But not everybody is able to do that. And so you're having a lot of people that, feel like I was just about to make this purchase and this was just, the rug was pulled out from under me at the last possible second. And, we've seen in other jurisdictions in some provinces where they've done this with incentives. What happens is it causes a total stall in the EV market because people step back and go, well, hold on. Maybe now's not the time. Maybe I'll wait and see if a new program comes forward. And so unfortunately, we expect EV sales to really go through the floor in the first quarter of 2025.
So the rebate program is gone, but the sales mandate is still in place. And that's the crux of your concern. So what would be the impact for dealerships and for manufacturers if this situation is to continue? There's no more federal rebate, but would dealerships then be still asked to comply with this target that's supposed to start next year? How does that work?
It's a great question. And this is the sort of dark side of this regulation, which the federal government tries not to answer questions on, because the reality is if a manufacturer cannot meet the EV sales target that has been regulated, if the consumer demand is not there and they can't sell enough EVs to be compliant with what the federal government is requiring, the only way to be in compliance with the regulation is to start to restrict your sale of gas-powered vehicles in Canada. And that is a absolute worst case scenario. Nobody wants to do that. What that means is that you could walk into a dealership. Maybe you have no ability to switch to electric because you've got no charging capacity at home. Maybe you have a very demanding a work commute that, extreme distance and a very cold climate. There's all sorts of reasons why maybe this doesn't work for you right now. You could go into a dealership and find out that, in fact, they can't sell you a gas-powered vehicle because the federal regulation is demanding that they achieve this artificial ratio of sales. So that's where this is going. Ultimately, that's going to mean higher prices for vehicles for Canadians and less choice. And that is an absolute worst-case scenario that could have economic impacts on dealerships it will damage auto manufacturers, and obviously it will hurt Canadians.
The trend for EV sales, let's take a broad look at this. Coming out of the pandemic, as things started to reopen, the economy started to get going again. We were hearing news stories for a few years that the trend looked good for EV sales. They were making up more and more of the percentage of vehicles sold. Here in 2025, a year before this mandate is supposed to kick in, what's the trend looking like these days?
Encouraging. So despite all of the challenges out there with infrastructure and incentives, we still see increasing interest for electric vehicles. And a big reason for that is because over the past few years, automakers have gone all in on electrification. We're talking about $1.2 trillion globally dedicated to this technology. In Canada, we had 3 EV models in 2012. There's well over 100 right now. And in every segment, right? We've got electric pickup trucks, SUVs, you name it. You can buy something or find something electric in every size and segment. So that's driving a lot of consumer interest. So we went from 11.2% zero emission vehicle sales. So that includes full electric plus plug-in hybrids in 2023. We just hit 16% in the third quarter of 24. So we'll probably end the year somewhere around there. So continue to see growth. The challenge is the growth isn't as high as people were anticipating a couple of years ago. There was a view at one point that we were almost on sort of an exponential growth curve. We're not seeing that. Yes, growth, but it's a little bit more moderated in terms of the year-over-year increases in sales.
Right. And, I hear lots of concerns from people who want to buy electric vehicles, can't afford electric vehicles, but aren't sure that the electric vehicle is going to suit their needs as a consumer. The chief one of those is range anxiety and charging anxiety. People are concerned about the availability of places to fuel these vehicles with electricity. What's the status of the charging network for electric vehicles in Canada?
So we have seen strong year-over-year growth in charging infrastructure, but unfortunately, it's not growing as fast as the mandated targets that have been established by government. So right now, there are 32,000 public chargers across the country. According to the federal government, this year we need 100,000. So that is a big gap. That is a very big gap, and that needs to continue to grow. According to the government's estimates, we need to see 40,000 public chargers installed every single year for the next decade. We have never installed 40,000 chargers in a single year, not even close in this country. The most we've ever seen come online in a fiscal year has been 7,000 chargers. So that's the challenge. We need an accelerated pace of this build out because right now, only 3% of the vehicle fleet is electric. Very small numbers of the overall fleet are actually electric. But imagine a world in which 50% of vehicles on the road are electric. We're going to need a massive amount of infrastructure to ensure that people can stop and conveniently and quickly charge their vehicles. Because at the end of the day, what we find is that if this is an inconvenience, people won't put up with it. It's just human nature.
Yeah, I'd like to continue at this thread where we cast our minds forward into the future and into what is possible. This idea that Canada could be a place where 100% of the cars on the road are fully electric. Given the limits of the technology, given the reality of Canadian geography, do you think that that vision is even realistic, just in terms of reality?
No, that was never realistic. And that's something that we've been quite clear about with the federal government since the get-go. Canada's unique, massive country, cold climate, and very long driving distances. It's not unusual for someone in Ontario to drive to see family or go to a hockey tournament on a weekend and put 1,200 kilometers on their car. Imagine telling a European that. I mean, that's just unheard of. They're preposterous distances that we drive, and we do it on the regular. And so we do have unique challenges here that make electrification for 100% of the population quite difficult. Think about a remote community in the north that's getting its electricity from a diesel generator. Doesn't make sense to be fully electric in that situation. So I think that was always more, frankly, communications than anything else. There is no pathway to 100%. That said, I've been driving an EV for the past year. This technology, for the overwhelming majority of Canadians, can absolutely meet their needs. We're now seeing vehicles with ranges well in excess of 450 kilometers. The cold weather operation is getting better and better. You can have an EV do virtually everything that you need to do. The question is, do we have the fast charging infrastructure in place so that there's no inconvenience when you do take those long road trips? And I can tell you from experience, the infrastructure is not there. It is a challenge, and that will be a turnoff for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think everybody's heard stories about situations and difficulties, whether it's along the 401 corridor or traveling between any major city out west. As soon as you get out of the city, suddenly those chargers become few and far between. Just back to the call from the industry groups this week on the mandate policy. I mean, I don't need to tell you, Brian, that a federal election is coming and it looks like there will be a different federal government coming in. So why are you looking for a response from the current federal government, which appears to be on its way out? Why not just wait for a new government to come in and lobby them? Is it about uncertainty for manufacturers and dealerships right now? Talk to me about that.
Well, two things. First of all, the fact that the government closed the incentive program is a huge problem. So that motivated a desire to get out there again and really drive home this message to the government that this isn't going to work. We also learned at the start of this year that the pace of charging infrastructure installations slowed last year. So those two items combined has just put the industry in an untenable situation. And even though we're likely to see a change in government in the near term, I think the federal government needs to be responsible for the policies that it is implementing. And they've put this policy forward, which puts Canadians in the industry in a really difficult position. And we want to hear from them. Well, do they honestly think that this is achievable? And have they contemplated the negative economic consequences? So that was what was really motivating this. But the other factor is, we are approaching one of the most consequential periods for the North American economy next week, with President Trump coming into power and proposing a 25% tariff on Canadian imports. Everything that we should be doing in Canada right now must be focused on making ourselves competitive with the United States. So if we do face these tariffs, we can survive, we can compete, we can continue to grow our economy. These sorts of regulations are very damaging at the worst possible time. So that was really the reason for getting out there and reiterating the call for a rethink of this mandate.
Yeah, I would like to ask you about the tariffs in just a second, but on the response from the current federal government, you made this call on Tuesday. Have you heard from them yet?
No, and I frankly don't expect to. They have been, we have been giving them, as well as lots of external automotive experts, forecasters. They have received reams of expert advice on the trend line and forecast for EV adoption over the past few years. All of that has been ignored in favor of environmental groups that effectively have given them made up targets. So I don't think that's going to change. I would be shocked. It would be nice if there'd be a bit of dose of reality injected into the government. But, given the track record, I don't think that's going to happen.
Okay. 25% across the board import tariff on Canadian products, including cars and auto parts, into the United States. If and when that comes into effect, what will that do in the immediate short term for the auto sector in this country? What kind of immediate impacts would that have?
Very significant negative impacts. Just to give you a sense of how integrated we are, I mean, there have been efforts by successive governments over decades to create an integrated North American economy. And so what that means is there is no such thing as a Canadian manufactured vehicle. There's no such thing as an American manufactured vehicle. We build vehicles together with huge amounts of content from North America in those vehicles. You could see a part cross a border 7 or 8 times before it is installed in a final vehicle in Canada or the United States. So this is a highly, highly integrated supply chain. And that's what makes the auto industry competitive with the world. We've been able to introduce new technologies across a broader market, bring down prices, offer more vehicles to consumers because we operate as one large North American market. So with a tariff of 25% on every single input, every time it moves across the border, we are looking at potential production stoppages. You could see job losses. This is a very, very bad situation. And let me be clear, this isn't just bad for Canada. This is bad for the United States. You'll recall when the Ambassador Bridge was blocked, we saw production shortages in the US because inputs, goods from Canada couldn't get to assembly lines in the United States. We are so tightly integrated in this supply chain. When you put a tariff like that in place, it will have negative consequences across the industry.
Yeah, I have heard it phrased this way recently. There's no American auto sector and Canadian auto sector. It's one sector. It's one fully integrated industry. So on whatever it is that incoming President Trump is looking to achieve with this, and there's lots of speculation about what, if anything, he is looking to achieve with this. Broadly speaking, Brian, the current trade rules for the auto sector in Canada and the US, is that working for everyone right now? It's a long history on that file back to the Auto Pact in the 60s, but is it broadly working right now? Are people more or less happy with the rules in place for the trade of autos and auto parts across the border?
Yes, very much so. And that's what makes this whole situation so complexing. Just a few years ago, we negotiated a new trade agreement at the behest of the Americans and President Trump. There was talk about tearing up NAFTA, but then we sat down through some bruising negotiations. Canada, Mexico, and the United States concluded the USMCA deal, largely focused on auto. And it included very stringent new rules that require high levels of North American content in vehicles that are built here. That agreement's working. Automakers are complying with it. We're seeing huge amounts of investment in the United States, big levels of investment in Canada as well, over $40 billion. So by every metric, this agreement is working and it's doing exactly what it intended to do. More North American content, more investment, more jobs in the United States. That's what makes this complex, rather odd, because we just signed this deal. It's only been in force for a few years. This is akin to, building a brand new home, much hard work. Then you walk into it on day one and you light it on fire. I mean, it makes no sense to do that, given that we just put in place this structure in this agreement. So the deal's working. I do think there's a path forward. We do build things together. And at the end of the day, tariffs are taxes. Prices are going to go up for Americans if this persists. And I don't think people are ready to acknowledge that.
Okay, well, we will wait and see what happens next week when all of this kicks off in earnest. Inauguration Day is on Monday. Brian Kingston, thank you so much for your time today. It's been great to have you as a guest on the show.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
And again, Brian Kingston is the president and CEO of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. That was the big story for today. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. I'm David Smith. Thank you for listening.